One, captain Rotterdam.
Negative 100,000.
Negative 10,000.
Negative 350.
No, 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 destroying. Guys, wake up.
A couple of hours later. Lot of boring math later. Laterer.
Much later.
Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Several days later. Several days later. Several days later. Several days later. Several long days later. Many disorderly days later. 1 week 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 later. 1 smelly week later. 1 soggy week later. 1 weekend of peppering later. 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 16 paranoia. 2,000 years later. 2,000-ish years later. 3,000 years later. 3,000 years later. 5 million years later. 1 entree later. An eternity later. An eternity later. 1 eternity later. Opening night. Eternity later. An eternity later. 1 eternity later. A couple of hours later. A lot of boring math later.
A lot of wallpapers later.
Very boring walks later. Many frame building attempts later. Many heartfelt traditions later. Many attempts to fix the past later. Many amusements later. Many invitations later. Many meets later. Many meets later. Many memories later. Many repressed memories later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. Many tic-tacs later. Many secret parties later. Many versions later. Many painful holes later. Many toys later. Many thoughts later. Much tranquility later. 1 humongous meal later. 1 semester later. 1 season later. 8 semesters later. 1 debt to society later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 1 load screen later. 1 loading screen later. 1 loading screen later. 1 little boost to the surface later. 1 pathetic soul story later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 long angry line later. 1 beautiful Christmas morning later. 1 movie later. 1 shift later. 1 shift later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 winner later. 1 nap later. 1 nap later. 1 operation later. 1 pair of pants later. 1 pair of pants later.
1 scary rot later.
1 tweet to the emergency room later. 1 billion, zillion, jillion, billion, cotillion times later. 2 idiots later.
3 annoying songs later.
82 kilometers later. 237 hours later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later.
800 kajillion potatoes later.
Thousands of tears later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later. Even more boat building attempts later. Graduation day. What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone?
Shape-shifting. Next lesson. Staring. Haunting houses. Last lesson. How to pick things up.
Epilogue.
Oh, sí. Yo veo pescado que no llama. Hago un one.
Haunting houses. Last lesson. How to pick things up.
Epilogue. Epilogue. 7 very boring hours later. Later that same morning. 6.5 ridiculous hours later. 9 unbelievable hours later. 12 hours later. After 20 hours at the show repair shop. 11 hours later. Evelyn, Quincy, Annie, and June arrived at their house. 20 really boring hours later. After Notikins arrived at their house. 13 hours later. Later, at this YouTube update.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
2 minutes, 37 seconds later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. Meanwhile, in the void, 1,000 plane engines, 10,000 torches later, 4,000 years later.
1 trillion explosions later that the old narrator got tired of waiting, and they had to hire a new one.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. Couple moments later. Many moments later. 1 pair of shows later. When Funny Fantasy arrived at North Pole Castle. Meanwhile, at the Golden Palace Stadium. Several song tracks later. A few rock of characters later. 1 million gutters later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, it's Stonehenge.
So much later that the old narrator got on the Pole Express going to the North Pole, and he had to come back to this one.
I don't know where will my feet take me today. Later.
Where will my feet take me today?
Be quiet. 4 to 6 weeks later. 12 o'clock. Noon. 15 hours of sleep later. 6 minutes. 37 seconds later. Later, in the dark. 50 roses. 55 pumpkins later. The next morning. Later that same afternoon. 30 turkeys later. 20 chickens freeze. 60 apple peas. 75 pumpkin peas later.
So much later that the old narrator got considerable to bring it back to this one for a few weeks.
15 hours of sleep later. 4 to 6 hours later. 4 to 6 seconds later. 4 to 6 more seconds later. 37 seconds later. After David Stone elevated the mall.
3,000 bottle of folk juices later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 4 to 6 minutes later. After Whitey and Eleanor arrived at community center. 4 to 6 more minutes later. Several moments later. More later.
So much later that the old narrator got called today. They had to bring him back to this one for a couple days.
5 billion Christmas presents later.
Stop irritating us all on her way. And this is starting to get really mad.
80,000 years later.
That's it. You asked for it. So much later that the old narrator got ran away, and they had to bring him back to this one.
4 days later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards. Several months.
Meanwhile in Milkwood River, multiple cups of coffee later, one party scene later. I don't know how much time later. A few moments later, to the previously mentioned a few moments later, to YouTube ads later, one poorly fitted template later, 15 seconds later.
How to pick things up.
Epilogue. Epilogue.
Game over.
Many, blowing up the whole earth for shade. Prison.
Yes, hello. I'll take your heaviest object. Try jiggling the antenna. Oh, I can see my house from here.
Merry Christmas!
Today's show went in all sorts of different directions. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Oh, it sure is good to be back. IPA! How about the usual?
One espresso, cut it right up.
And so ends another exciting episode of The Patrick Star Show. The end. Not responsible for shattered teeth. Oh, Wise King, we missed you so. Why, that dude?
We had overdue books too. Going on.
Going on.
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile in Milkwood River, multiple cups of coffee later, one